Before we start, leave a comment with your location and the time. Context matters more than it seems. There's a name in the mythos that's often spoken but rarely understood. Azathoth. Not a monster, not a god in any familiar sense. Just a word, unfolding slowly in the dark, like something ancient that was never meant to be remembered. Today we go back to the moment before memory, before language tried to describe the center of all things and failed. What if the origin of Azathoth has already been lost, not by accident, but by necessity? Not hidden, but erased by something that did not want to be known. This name does not come with stories. It comes with silences. It does not threaten. It renders everything else irrelevant. And yet, the clues are scattered. In poetry, Lovecraft barely revised. In physics texts, he only half understood. In ancient philosophies, that offered no comfort. This is not the beginning of a story. It is the edge of something that should not have form, and yet, here it is, still muttering behind the stars. We must move carefully now, because once you trace the outline of this idea, you cannot return to how you saw the world before. Azathoth was never meant to be a character. It was meant to be a warning. The idea that would later be called Azathoth did not appear fully formed. It emerged during a period when inherited explanations of the universe were failing at multiple levels. Between roughly 1890 and 1930, Western intellectual life underwent a rapid collapse of certainty. Darwinian evolution had already displaced humanity from the center of creation. Thermodynamics suggested an eventual heat death of all systems. Astronomy expanded the universe beyond any meaningful scale of human relevance. These developments did not merely add new facts. They undermined purpose itself. For writers sensitive to implication rather than optimism, this created a problem literature had not yet solved: how to represent a universe that functions without regard for meaning. H.P. Lovecraft encountered this intellectual climate early and absorbed it deeply. By the 1910s, while still writing amateur essays and poetry, he had adopted a strict materialist worldview. According to his letters, he rejected free will, divine intention, and moral design outright. Reality, as he understood it, was mechanical and indifferent. This position was not fashionable despair, but philosophical commitment. It shaped what he believed fiction could do. Stories were not vehicles for moral struggle. They were instruments for revealing scale. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft did not aim to frighten through danger. He aimed to unsettle by implication, by showing how little danger was required in a universe that did not notice us at all. Azathoth first appears in this context as a conceptual necessity rather than a narrative invention. The earliest reference comes from Lovecraft's poem, Azathoth, written around 1922. The poem is brief, unfinished, and structurally vague. That vagueness is not a flaw. It reveals intent. The figure at the center of the poem is not described acting, deciding, or judging. It exists as a source of mindless motion. This matters. Lovecraft was not creating a supreme being in the mythological sense. He was naming a limit, an endpoint where explanation breaks down, not a creator, but a condition under which creation accidentally persists. World War I intensified this outlook rather than causing it. The war did not introduce Lovecraft to meaninglessness, but it confirmed it. Industrialized death, bureaucratic slaughter, and technological scale reinforced the idea that systems operate independently of ethics. At the same time, advances in physics were destabilizing classical causality. Einstein's work after 1905 challenged intuitive time and space. Popular science magazines, which Lovecraft read obsessively, translated these ideas into public anxiety. The universe was no longer just large. It was strange. This strangeness demanded a symbolic anchor. Azathoth became that anchor, embodying not chaos as rebellion, but chaos as default condition. We must pause here to clarify creator intent, because later interpretations often distort it. Lovecraft did not imagine Azathoth as ruling anything. There is no throne in any political sense. The so-called center is metaphorical, not spatial. This reveals something profound. Authority in Lovecraft's universe does not flow downward. It does not flow at all. Azathoth represents a universe without hierarchy, where motion precedes meaning, and persistence requires no justification. This is not X, but Y, not malevolence, but indifference so complete that malice never enters the equation. Lovecraft's correspondence supports this reading. In letters written during the 1920s and early 1930s, he repeatedly described reality as purposeless, mechanical, and alien to values. These are not casual words. They form a consistent framework. When later readers imagine Azathoth as asleep, dreaming reality into being, they impose narrative logic that Lovecraft himself resisted. There is no evidence he believed in a dreaming mind behind existence. The image functions symbolically, not literally. It communicates instability, not intention. One comparison clarifies this. Where classical creation myths explain why the world exists, Azathoth explains why explanation itself fails. By the late 1920s, Lovecraft began embedding this concept indirectly across his fiction. He did not foreground it. He allowed it to remain distant, referenced through fragments, chants, and unreliable texts. This restraint was deliberate. Direct exposure would collapse the effect. Azathoth works only when approached obliquely, as a background assumption rather than a revealed truth. Its origin, then, is not a single story or moment. It is the convergence of scientific disillusionment, philosophical pessimism, and a writer committed to following implications wherever they led, even when they led nowhere comforting. This historical grounding prepares us for a deeper question. If Azathoth did not emerge from myth or theology, then where did its underlying logic come from? To answer that, we must step further back, beyond Lovecraft himself, into the older philosophical traditions that taught him how to think about a universe without purpose. Azathoth did not begin with Lovecraft. While the name itself is his invention, the philosophical scaffolding beneath it is older, stranger, and more unsettling than most readers realize. Lovecraft inherited not just motifs, but intellectual frameworks, many of which already question the existence of order, meaning, or purpose in the cosmos. Understanding Azathoth requires tracing those frameworks, not through occultism, but through ancient philosophy, 19th century metaphysics, and the collapse of Enlightenment confidence. The earliest clear precursor lies in the apeiron, a concept proposed by the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander around the 6th century BCE. The apeiron was not a god. It was the indefinite, the boundless origin of all things, without qualities or intentions. For Anaximander, reality began not with personality, but with imbalance, an abstract churn that produced the world through contradiction and tension. This matters because Azathoth operates on similar terms, not as an actor, but as a condition. When Lovecraft envisions a blind, idiot force at the center of existence, he draws unconsciously from this ancient, non-anthropomorphic vision of cosmic origin, not divine will, but unstable potential. Centuries later, this notion resurfaces in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Writing in the early 19th century, Schopenhauer rejected rational optimism and described the universe as driven by a blind, irrational will, an endless striving without direction or goal. The will for Schopenhauer was not evil. It was worse than evil, unconscious, unmotivated, and incapable of meaning. Lovecraft did not cite Schopenhauer often, but the conceptual overlap is striking. Azathoth embodies not malice, but motion without mind. The drumming and piping are not ritualistic. They are mechanical, background noise mistaken for music. Consider this carefully. The idea that existence continues not because of design, but because of inertia, did not originate in horror. It originated in metaphysics. A similar thread appears in the writings of Nietzsche, particularly in his critique of metaphysics and morality. While Nietzsche celebrates creative rebellion and meaning-making, he also acknowledges the void that emerges when inherited structures collapse. The abyss he famously warned about is not simply emptiness. It is the awareness that systems of value are human inventions. Azathoth can be read as that abyss made symbol, a center with no moral orientation, a throne that rules nothing, a dreamer whose dream does not favor us. Unlike Nietzsche's creative individual, Lovecraft's figures do not confront the void. They glimpse it and shatter. Scientific shifts in Lovecraft's lifetime reinforced these older ideas. Popular science in the early 20th century often sensationalized the idea of entropy, the eventual decline of all ordered systems into uniform stillness. The heat death of the universe became a popular theme in newspapers, journals, and speculative fiction. But Lovecraft's genius was to translate thermodynamic despair into symbolic form. Azathoth is not entropy as process. It is entropy as personality, though that personality is false, a mask worn by physics to mimic mythology. The godlike imagery conceals the true horror, that there is no God behind it. Lovecraft was also indirectly influenced by Eastern philosophies, though rarely with precision. He was aware of Buddhist and Hindu cosmologies, particularly their cyclical views of time and their portrayal of reality as illusion or dream. While Lovecraft never embraced these traditions, elements of their logic bleed into the structure of his mythos. Azathoth resembles a perverse version of Brahman, a formless totality that is not sacred, but indifferent. The dream it produces is not liberation, it is confinement, not illusion hiding joy, but illusion hiding absence. We must pause here. What unites these antecedents, pre-Socratic chaos, Schopenhauer's will, Nietzsche's abyss, thermodynamic entropy, and Eastern illusion, is their shared rejection of human centrality. Azathoth condenses this rejection into a single image, a mindless origin that keeps spinning, not because it chooses to, but because nothing ever stopped it. This is not a cosmic villain. It is the collapse of the question, why, itself. The flute, the drum, the center, they all point to the same condition, structure without intention. This philosophical inheritance explains why Lovecraft resisted giving Azathoth a personality, a story, or a purpose. To do so would betray the very logic that made the concept powerful. Azathoth is not a character to be developed. It is a framework to be realized. In the next section, we will examine how Lovecraft used sound, language, and broken etymology to signal what Azathoth is not, and why every name we give it only deepens the illusion that it can be known. Azathoth is not a word designed to be understood. It does not derive from any known language. It offers no root, no suffix, no translation. This is deliberate. In creating the name, Lovecraft chose not to mimic Latin Greek, or even the Pseudo-Arabic style used for Necronomicon. Instead, he produced something that sounded ancient but meant nothing. Phonetic noise mistaken for power. That choice reveals his intent. Azathoth was never meant to be spoken. It was meant to resist being spoken clearly at all. There is no reliable etymology for Azathoth, and no known language from which it meaningfully descends. Scholars have speculated, some linking the first syllable to Azazel, the biblical scapegoat demon, others to Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge. But these links collapse under scrutiny. Lovecraft never confirmed them, and his personal notes suggest otherwise. In one letter, he claimed the name came to him in a dream. If that is true, its structure emerges not from linguistic history, but from subconscious symbolism. The harsh Z, the buried Th, the terminal guttural consonant. These are not semantic units. They are sounds designed to evoke something broken, collapsing inward, never fully formed. We must pause here. In traditional mythologies, names are keys. To name something is to gain partial control or understanding of it. Azathoth reverses that rule. The name offers no access. It blocks comprehension. This is not a cipher waiting to be decoded. It is a noise pretending to be language. The very act of naming becomes a trap. Readers approach it expecting meaning, and instead find an absence that grows more profound the longer it is considered. That is the function of the name, to imply meaning while denying it. Even the descriptions surrounding Azathoth rely on anti-symbolism. Drums and flutes are often interpreted as ritual instruments, but in Lovecraft's texts, they are stripped of cultural context. The drumming is mindless, repetitive, and without pattern. The flutes do not accompany ceremony. They spiral endlessly, producing sound without melody or purpose. These are not artistic expressions. They are mechanical noise. Lovecraft uses them to replace intentionality with motion. The center of the universe does not speak. It mutters. It pulses. It repeats. This matters. Azathoth is not silent, but its noise means nothing. Compare this to the symbolic function of chaos in older traditions. In Mesopotamian myths, chaos is often personified. Tiamat, the dragon of primordial waters, is defeated by a god of order. In Greek tradition, chaos precedes cosmos, but is eventually shaped by divine will. Even in the Bible, the formless void is organized by speech. Lovecraft rejects this progression. Azathoth is not pre-order. It is post-order. What remains when the idea of order has decayed, but the universe keeps going out of habit. There is no speech that can tame it, no narrative that can contain it, no sacrifice that can satisfy it. The few adjectives Lovecraft attaches to Azathoth, blind, idiot, nuclear, demon, must be read symbolically. Blind and idiot do not mean stupidity or lack of intelligence in the ordinary sense. They mean total absence of awareness or reflection. Nuclear is particularly interesting. It predates nuclear weapons, and in Lovecraft's usage refers to the center or core, something foundational but unstable. The phrase nuclear chaos reads today like prophecy, but in his time, it simply meant chaos at the root. Again, not malevolence, but instability disguised as law. One might ask, if Azathoth cannot be named meaningfully, why name it at all? The answer lies in narrative misdirection. Lovecraft's fictional texts often present names as if they were secrets, hidden, forbidden, encoded. This lures the reader into an interpretive posture. We want to decipher, but the name Azathoth exists to frustrate that desire. It performs the role of a name while erasing the function. It is a placeholder for absence, The more the reader tries to define it, the more undefined it becomes. In this way, Azathoth's name is a rhetorical device. It acts as a warning to the reader. That language will not serve them here. That meaning, when pushed to its limit, may no longer behave like meaning. This prepares us for the next layer of Lovecraft's strategy, his use of invented texts, unreliable narrators, and fragmentary references. In the following section, we will examine how Lovecraft constructed an entire narrative system, preserve Azathoth's unknowability, not by hiding it, but by flooding it with too much meaningless information. Lovecraft's mythology does not function like traditional myth. It offers no origin stories, no moral frameworks, no pantheons with comprehensible roles. Instead, it operates through fragments, contradictions, and silences. Azathoth is perhaps the purest expression of this approach. It is not revealed through direct narrative. It is constructed through absence, through the careful implication that something lies behind the world, but that anything we say about it is already incorrect. This technique is not a flaw. It is a method of preserving authenticity by making certainty impossible. Lovecraft achieved this effect by embedding Azathoth within a web of invented sources. The Necronomicon, the Book of Ibon, the Pnakotic manuscripts. None of these are real, but all are treated as if they are. They are cited in footnotes, quoted briefly, and never fully shown. This mimicry of scholarly convention lends credibility to the narrative. But more importantly, it mirrors the way real ancient texts often survive, in pieces through commentaries, partially translated. Azathoth's mythos is not delivered. It is reconstructed, always incompletely. The act of reading becomes archaeological. The more we uncover, the more we realize how much has been lost, or was never knowable to begin with. This strategy aligns with Lovecraft's core goal, to create not a story, but a texture of reality in which horror resides. Azathoth is rarely the subject of any narrative. It does not appear. It is mentioned. This indirectness generates credibility. In actual human cultures, central religious or philosophical ideas are often treated with reverence, fear, or strategic vagueness. By withholding detail, Lovecraft imitates that dynamic. Azathoth feels real because it is never fully explained. We believe it not because we understand it, but because its ambiguity is consistent. The use of unreliable narrators deepens this effect. Characters who mention Azathoth are often mad, dying, or hallucinating. Their accounts are laced with contradictions. One calls it the demon sultan. Another hints at a center of the universe without naming it. A third dreams of it, but wakes screaming. These inconsistencies are not errors. They simulate the distortions found in religious testimony, mystical visions, or corrupted manuscripts. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft builds trust by allowing nothing to be fully trusted. The reader becomes complicit, forced to judge between unstable fragments while knowing none of them can be complete. Even the visual descriptions Lovecraft provides serve to destabilize. There is no consistent image of Azathoth. It is sometimes surrounded by flutes, sometimes not, sometimes asleep, sometimes merely unaware. Its court is described, but never named. These narrative choices undermine the reader's instinct to fix a mental picture. Azathoth resists iconography. It cannot be visualized without distortion. In this way, Lovecraft rejects the typical arc of mythology, where repetition creates clarity. Here, repetition multiplies confusion. The more we hear the name, the less we know what it refers to. This stands in contrast to later myth-building traditions, especially those that codify systems. For example, Tolkien's Silmarillion or Campbell's monomyth structure offers cohesion. Everything has a place. Not so with Lovecraft. His goal was not synthesis, but erosion. Azathoth is not a node in a mythic tree. It is the void beneath it. Attempts to clarify its lore after Lovecraft's death often weaken its effect. Derleth's moral classifications, for instance, introduced fire, water, and other elemental assignments. But these changes violated the original function. Azathoth is not part of a system. It is the thing systems are built to ignore. We must pause here. The power of Azathoth lies not in what it is, but in what it disallows. It denies coherence. It sabotages explanation. In doing so, it achieves something rare in horror, a mythology that feels more real because it cannot be resolved. Readers do not walk away with answers. They walk away with the sense that something vast has been hinted at, and that their minds are smaller than they thought. In the next section, we will explore how these implications begin to cohere philosophically. Azathoth is not merely unknowable. It is a concept that transforms what knowing even means. At the center of Azathoth's symbolic function are three interlocking ideas: cosmic insignificance, irreversible entropy, and the instability of perceived reality. These are not themes in the conventional sense. They are ontological conditions. Azathoth does not represent them metaphorically. It reveals them structurally. Its presence in Lovecraft's mythos is not active, but gravitational. It warps every philosophical assumption that surrounds it. To invoke Azathoth is to invite collapse, not of buildings or bodies, but of frameworks that once made existence feel coherent. The first and most consistent theme is insignificance, not social, not personal, but cosmological. Azathoth renders humanity irrelevant by its very nature. It is not hostile. It does not notice. This is crucial. In The Whisperer in Darkness, Lovecraft writes, "It is not any one thing that frightens. It is the total lack of context." Azathoth deepens that fear. Its absence of intent removes the last illusion of importance. Most mythologies preserve some role for the human observer: witness, victim, interpreter. Azathoth denies even that. Its dream does not include us, and if it wakes, it will not recognize that anything has changed. Insignificance becomes unbearable when paired with entropy. Lovecraft was writing during a period when the second law of thermodynamics, the inevitable decay of systems into disorder, was widely publicized. The concept of heat death fascinated and horrified thinkers of the early 20th century. Azathoth does not cause this entropy. It is the condition under which it happens. In the mythos, it is described as nuclear chaos, a phrase that predates the atomic age. The term nuclear meant central or core, not radioactive. Lovecraft envisioned a reality where the fundamental center was not structure, but breakdown. Azathoth spins because it cannot stop. There is no stabilizing will, no higher mind. The universe continues not because it is guided, but because it has not yet reached equilibrium. We must pause here. Entropy is often misunderstood as destruction, but in Lovecraft's usage, it is deeper than that. It is continuation without direction. Azathoth does not end things. It allows them to continue in meaningless repetition. The drums and flutes that surround it are not heralds. They are echoes, sound without signal, ritual without purpose. This reveals something profound. Horror, in this context, is not a sudden event, but a long erosion. Not death, but endurance without meaning. The final concept, and perhaps the most difficult, is dream reality. In Lovecraft's later work, especially the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the boundary between dream and waking becomes unstable. Azathoth sits at the center of this instability. He is referred to as the blind idiot god, who gnaws hungrily in the dark at the center of all infinity. But this center is not spatial, it is conceptual. Azathoth is often described as dreaming the universe into existence. This should not be read as metaphysical authority. The dream is not deliberate, it is accidental. Existence is not designed, but accidental byproduct. If Azathoth wakes, reality ends, not because it is destroyed, but because it was never real in the first place. This position aligns loosely with certain Eastern philosophies, particularly the idea that reality is Maya, illusion. But Lovecraft inverts the comfort these traditions sometimes offer. There is no enlightenment, no release, only awareness that the dream is not yours. Consider this carefully. Azathoth's dream does not belong to the observer. The observer is part of the dream. There is no exit, only the threat of realization. What makes these concepts effective is their interdependence. Insignificance removes purpose. Entropy removes order. Dream reality removes certainty. Azathoth is not a character inserted into this structure. It is the structure. It embodies a system where all three forces converge. When readers encounter Azathoth, they are not reading about an entity. They are brushing against a framework designed to destabilize their assumptions. This is not metaphor, it is function. In the next section, we will move from the abstract to the symbolic, examining the beings that orbit Azathoth and what their proximity reveals. If Azathoth is the center, then those who serve or surround it must reflect aspects of its nature. And the closer one gets, the less human the logic becomes. Azathoth is never alone, yet it is never accompanied in any human sense. Around it gathers a loose assembly of beings, often called the outer gods, though the term gather already misleads. These entities do not assemble by choice or loyalty. They exist in relation to a center that does not acknowledge them. Their proximity is structural, not devotional. Lovecraft presents them as forces shaped by position rather than purpose. Each reflects a partial function of the cosmos: communication, totality, mediation, while Azathoth reflects none. It remains the condition that allows such functions to exist without explaining why they exist at all. Nyarlathotep occupies the most visible role among these forces. Unlike Azathoth, Nyarlathotep speaks, travels, and adapts. He wears faces. He persuades. In the Nyarlathotep, Lovecraft describes him as a messenger who brings strange instruments of glass and metal to humanity. This contrast is essential. Nyarlathotep represents intelligence within an unintelligent universe. He does not oppose Azathoth. He translates it. Not truth, but proximity. Not meaning, but consequence. Where Azathoth is static chaos, Nyarlathotep is mobile implication. He allows the center's indifference to touch human minds without explanation. Yog-Sothoth functions differently. It is not mobile, nor deceptive. It is described as the all-in-one and one-in-all, a phrase that suggests total integration of time and space. Yog-Sothoth knows. That knowledge is complete and useless. It does not act on what it knows. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, access to Yog-Sothoth brings comprehension without agency. This matters. If Nyarlathotep connects Azathoth to humanity through influence, Yog-Sothoth connects it through structure. It reveals that all moments exist simultaneously, and that causality is a human convenience. Azathoth, by contrast, exists outside even that totality. It is not everywhere. It is beneath the idea of everywhere. We must pause here. These entities are often mistaken for a hierarchy, but hierarchy implies direction. There is none. The so-called court of Azathoth, those amorphous dancers and mindless pipers, does not govern. It circulates. The flutes and drums do not honor Azathoth. They prevent something worse: silence. Sound here is not music. It is stabilization. The implication is unsettling. If the noise stops, reality does not end violently. It simply ceases to maintain coherence. The universe is not protected by love or law, but by distraction. Dreamland's beings add another layer. In Lovecraft's dream cycle, entities like Nodens appear more benevolent, even protective. Yet their power is limited. They operate within dreams, which are already unstable. Dreams serve as buffers between humanity and the implications of Azathoth. They soften scale, they translate abstraction into image, but even here, Azathoth remains unreachable. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the throne at the center cannot be approached. The dream collapses before contact. This is not narrative tension. It is philosophical boundary enforcement. Consider how this differs from traditional myth systems. In Greek mythology, gods interact, argue, and intervene. In Christian theology, angels serve with purpose. In Lovecraft's system, entities coexist without coordination. They do not share goals, they share conditions. This is not X, but Y, not a pantheon, but a pressure system. Each force responds to the same underlying instability in different ways. None can alter it, none can replace it. Lovecraft reinforces this through quotation and repetition across texts. The phrase "blind idiot god" appears more than once, but never explained. The repetition does not clarify. It erodes confidence. Readers search for definition and find only reinforcement of absence. The entities around Azathoth function similarly. Each offers partial clarity that collapses when examined closely. Knowledge increases. Control does not. By mapping these surrounding forces, we see Azathoth more clearly by contrast. It does not communicate like Nyarlathotep. It does not know like Yog-Sothoth. It does not even dream in a meaningful sense. It persists. That persistence defines the limits of all other beings. In the next section, we will examine what happens when human consciousness brushes against this system, and why madness in Lovecraft's work is not a failure of mind, but a correct response to unbearable accuracy. Azathoth is not encountered, it is inferred. And this distinction is critical. Human beings in Lovecraft's mythos do not face Azathoth directly, nor do they worship it in the traditional sense. They come to suspect it exists, somewhere beyond the boundary of language or reason, and that suspicion alone is enough to fracture the mind. In this framework, madness is not a breakdown. It is a consequence. The mind, when exposed to something that violates the terms of reality it depends upon, reacts by dissolving the illusion that made perception bearable. Unlike figures in myth or religion who approach divine knowledge through ritual or devotion, Lovecraft's protagonists stumble into forbidden insight by mistake. In The Dreams in the Witch House, the student Walter Gilman dreams of chaotic geometries and finds himself in impossible spaces. These dream journeys do not deliver meaning, they strip it away. The further Gilman travels, the more he loses any stable referent for time, shape, or identity. Azathoth is never named, but the implications are there: centerless power, meaningless noise, directionless presence. What breaks Gilman's mind is not what he sees, but the realization that the structure of seeing itself cannot be trusted. Madness in this system is not irrationality. It is accuracy without defense. In The Haunter of the Dark, Robert Blake becomes obsessed with a church that holds a being known as the Haunter. While the being is named separately, the story repeatedly suggests a deeper, more terrible presence behind it, one that can only be gestured toward. Blake's descent into madness is marked not by loss of thought, but by overabundance. He begins to see connections where others see randomness. He reads too deeply. And in Lovecraft's universe, deep reading is a dangerous act. The more coherent the cosmic structure becomes, the less room it leaves for the human observer to exist. We must pause here. In classical horror, madness is often a result of trauma, guilt, or supernatural interference. But in Lovecraft, and especially in relation to Azathoth, madness is epistemic. It arises from knowing something that cannot be integrated into any prior model of reality. There is no cure, because there was no illness. The mind did its job too well, and was undone by accuracy. This reveals something profound. Madness is not a failing, but a transformation. The subject who is seen as Azathoth, truly seen, is not damaged. They are no longer compatible with the shared hallucination called consensus reality. This inversion transforms the concept of fear. Traditional fear depends on threat. Something must be lost, damaged, or taken. Azathoth removes that axis. It does not take anything from you. It shows you that you had nothing to begin with. There is no self, no purpose, no context. The mind flails not because it is weak, but because it was never built to endure this kind of clarity. This is not fear as adrenaline. It is fear as philosophical collapse. Even the indirect approaches through dreams, rituals, or texts generate the same outcome. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, the gradual accumulation of historical fragments leads the protagonist to uncover truths that destabilize his identity. The texts involved are not powerful in themselves. Their power lies in what they reveal, that history is not linear, that time does not flow cleanly, and that consciousness is not confined to a single life or body. Azathoth is never mentioned, but the sense of foundational instability echoes its presence. Where traditional horror monsters operate by breaking into our world, Azathoth breaks the idea of world itself. This function of madness, as unwanted understanding, reframes the entire cosmic horror genre. The monster is not in the shadows. The monster is in the realization that shadows don't matter. Azathoth never touches the protagonist. It doesn't need to. The mere possibility that something like Azathoth exists destabilizes the rules of thought. In the next section, we will explore the final turn of this spiral, the pursuit of forbidden knowledge itself, and why in Lovecraft's mythos, the most dangerous thing is not what we see, but what we seek to understand. In traditional narratives, forbidden knowledge corrupts because it grants power without morality. Trentio. Lovecraft's mythos, especially in relation to Azathoth, this pattern is reversed. The knowledge is not dangerous because it empowers. It is dangerous because it removes the illusion that power ever existed. Forbidden knowledge here is not a key. It is a mirror, held up to the mind until the reflection no longer resembles the one looking. To seek understanding of Azathoth is to confront the possibility that knowledge itself is a human construct, and that outside it, there is only noise. Lovecraft's stories are filled with texts, torn pages, untranslated manuscripts, ritual notes scribbled in the margins of sanity. These objects mimic the tools of scholarship, but they do not behave like repositories of enlightenment. The Necronomicon is the most famous, yet it never offers revelation. It offers contradiction. It contains too much, says too little, and drives those who study it into disintegration. It's not cursed in the magical sense. It's epistemically corrosive. Like Azathoth itself, it resists coherence while pretending to offer it. It presents structure, but only as a mask worn by chaos. In The Dreams in the Witch House, the protagonist attempts to reconcile advanced mathematics with folklore. What results is not synthesis, but fracture. The deeper the inquiry, the more unstable the framework becomes. Lovecraft here exposes a terrifying possibility that the methods of reason, logic, and scientific inquiry will not protect us from the void. They may lead us directly into it. Azathoth is not anti-science. It is what science discovers once it abandons human hope. Consider this carefully. The collapse is not caused by superstition. It is caused by consistency taken to its conclusion. This shift reframes the archetype of the seeker. In older horror, the fool who opens the wrong book is punished for curiosity. In Lovecraft, the seeker is often intelligent, methodical, and sincere. Their mistake is not recklessness. It is that they believed reality could be understood without cost. In The Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legrasse gathers facts, cross-references, cults, interviews eyewitnesses. What he finds is not clarity, but a slow evaporation of explanatory language. The more facts he collects, the less sense they make together. Forbidden knowledge does not contradict known reality. It dissolves the assumption that reality can be known. We must pause here. This is not simply intellectual despair. It is structural disassembly. Lovecraft's depiction of Azathoth implies that there is no stable referent for meaning itself. To know something about Azathoth is to know that categories, truth, falsehood, self, other, do not apply. This leads to a collapse of mental frameworks, not as a plot device, but as a philosophical necessity. Forbidden knowledge is not hidden because it is evil. It is hidden because exposure causes systems to unright themselves. Azathoth does not punish the seeker. It renders the act of seeking itself incoherent. This logic extends to rituals and invocations. Unlike in traditional occult fiction, no character in Lovecraft's work successfully harnesses the power of Azathoth. There are no bargains, no outcomes. Even when texts seem to describe summoning practices, they end in dissolution, not transformation. The ritual exists not to call Azathoth, but to demonstrate that the idea of calling anything has already failed. Lovecraft's cultists are not priests. They are echoes, humans mimicking the gestures of understanding without realizing that meaning died long before the ritual began. In this way, Azathoth becomes the ultimate emblem of epistemic collapse. It marks the boundary where thought cannot cross without vanishing. The mind, trained to categorize and connect, finds only recursion and contradiction. Forbidden knowledge, then, is not an entry into deeper truths. It is a slow erasure of the frameworks that made truth seem possible. In the next section, we will examine how these themes are dramatized across Lovecraft's fiction. The horror is not in what the characters find, but in what their stories, once read closely, refuse to resolve. Azathoth's presence in Lovecraft's work begins not with description, but with a name. Its earliest known mention appears in a short prose poem titled Azathoth, c. 1922, published in The Fantasy Fan in 1938. The piece is brief, less than 150 words, and offers no mythology, no attributes, no theology. It begins simply, "When age fell upon the world, and wonder went out of the minds of men." The narrator flees modernity in search of forgotten truths, but the passage ends before the entity itself appears. This omission is intentional. Even here, Azathoth exists as a destination that cannot be reached, an idea that must remain just outside articulation. Lovecraft begins the myth not with revelation, but with retreat. This absence defines Azathoth's function across Lovecraft's corpus, is mentioned in more than a dozen stories, yet never dramatized. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-27, Azathoth is described as the blind idiot god who sits at the center of ultimate chaos and is lulled by the thin monotonous piping of a demoniac flute. The phrasing here matters. Ultimate chaos is not a battlefield. It is a condition of formlessness. The flutes are not celebration. They are repetition without progression. The throne of Azathoth is unreachable, not guarded, but conceptually unreachable, because proximity would mean collapse, not contact. What unites these references is a strategy of deferment. Azathoth is never the subject of a scene. It is always background, always upstream of action. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, Azathoth is named once in a chant. Ea Shub Nigarath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. E Hastur, E Yugoth, E Azathoth. The context is ritual, but no detail follows. There is no elaboration, no theology, no mythic episode. Instead, the name functions as an anchor, a signal that something deeper and more dangerous lies beneath the visible. Azathoth operates like dark matter. It shapes the narrative by its absence. This technique allows Lovecraft to tie disparate texts into a mythos without resolving their contradictions. In the Dunwich Horror, Azathoth is referenced in the infamous passage from the Necronomicon. Nor is it to be thought that man is either the oldest or the last of Earth's masters. That is not dead, which can eternal lie. Though the passage names Cthulhu, the cosmological logic echoes Azathoth's structure. Time does not move linearly. Death is not permanent, and existence is not designed for us. Azathoth becomes the gravitational center that makes these other horrors possible, not because it commands them, but because its existence erases any boundary between cause and consequence. We must pause here. Azathoth's intertextual presence is not additive. It is corrosive. Each mention doesn't build lore. It unbuilds it. Take The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, where Robert Blake reads of the mad, faceless god Azathoth, at whose name the foul legions quake. But the story focuses on a different entity, the Haunter, a lesser avatar. Azathoth is background noise, invoked in passing, but that invocation signals a shift in scale. Whatever the protagonist fears is only a fragment of something larger and less coherent. The name becomes a compression of horror, not its release. This network of references creates a mythos that behaves unlike mythology. In traditional systems, repeated mention of a figure brings clarity, coherence, iconography. In Lovecraft's system, repeated mention of Azathoth multiplies uncertainty. It is never the end point of a narrative. It is the rupture. Readers who trace the name across stories begin to feel its shape, not as a figure, but as an absence threaded through seemingly unrelated texts. This is not world building. It is world unmaking. The more the stories connect, the more unstable their foundations become. In this way, Azathoth serves a unifying function not through action, but through implication. It connects the Dream Quest, Whisperer, Haunter, and others not by plot, but by tone. Each story is haunted by something beyond naming, beyond agency, beyond knowledge. In the next section, we will examine one of these narratives in depth, where the presence of Azathoth is most direct, yet still incomplete. Because even in its clearest appearance, the entity remains a center that cannot hold. only echo. Among all of Lovecraft's works, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written c. 1926-1927, offers the most direct, but still carefully veiled, exploration of Azathoth's place in the mythos. The story is long, sprawling, and structurally dreamlike. It follows Randolph Carter as he searches through the dreamlands for a hidden city of beauty. Along the way, Carter encounters gods, monsters, cults, and symbols, but never certainty. The journey, while fantastical on the surface, gradually becomes metaphysical. The further Carter travels, the closer he comes not to revelation, but to epistemic annihilation. Azathoth is mentioned several times, but always from afar. Its name emerges as a whispered warning, not a narrative goal. Late in the story, Carter is seized by night gaunts and taken to the Onyx Castle of the Great Ones, who ultimately deliver him toward the court of Azathoth. But the throne is never reached. Lovecraft writes, "There is no escape from the sightless demon sultan Azathoth, at the center of all things." This sentence appears just as Carter is pulled from his dream and awakes. The timing is intentional. Carter does not confront Azathoth. He glimpses the idea of it and flees. The dream ends not with understanding, but with refusal. What matters in Dream Quest is not what Azathoth does, but how the narrative architecture collapses the closer Carter comes. The story begins as a quest, a classic heroic structure, but this structure disintegrates. As Carter approaches what should be the climax, the story unravels. Settings become more abstract. Encounters become symbolic. Geography yields to disorientation. Azathoth's gravitational pull does not lead to encounter. It leads to dissolution. The journey is not toward knowledge, but toward a void that cannot sustain narrative form. We must pause here. Dream Quest mimics the structure of spiritual pilgrimage, but corrupts its reward. In traditional myth, the seeker approaches the divine, and either dies, is transformed, or receives wisdom. Here, Carter's reward is disillusionment. The city he sought was a projection of his own childhood memories. The gods he feared are ineffectual, and the supreme being, Azathoth, is not wisdom incarnate, but a symbol of incoherence. Lovecraft leaves no room for transcendence. The protagonist does not ascend. He retreats, not because he is weak, but because he recognizes that nothing at the center will support him. This refusal of climax serves Azathoth's narrative function perfectly. The entity cannot be seen or described without collapsing the logic of story. Lovecraft circumvents this by using structural implication. The narrative deteriorates in rhythm and tone as it approaches the idea of Azathoth. Syntax becomes more unstable. Descriptions become more abstract. Time becomes elastic. These changes enact the effect of Azathoth on the reader. Even in fiction, it cannot be approached without cost. Critically, Azathoth never appears as a character in Dream Quest. It is never visualized. It has no dialogue, no intentions, no direct effect on Carter. Yet it is present throughout the story's architecture. Its influence is gravitational, not behavioral. It shapes events by threatening to end them. This is not a god who intervenes. It is a void around which meaning orbits until it decays. The flute and drum imagery returns in fragments, functioning as auditory warnings, symbols of stability dissolving into repetition. By embedding Azathoth at the unreachable center of Dream Quest, Lovecraft performs an unusual act for genre fiction. He denies resolution. The story functions not to satisfy curiosity, but to punish it. Carter's pursuit of beauty ends in the confrontation with emptiness. He awakens not wiser, but but smaller. In this way, Dream Quest becomes the most complete dramatization of Azathoth's philosophical role. The journey to the center reveals there is no center. The throne is empty, or worse, occupied by something unaware that thrones exist. In the next section, we will explore another story that approaches Azathoth from a different angle, not as destination, but as threat glimpsed through layers of symbolism and obsession. If Dream Quest shows us the collapse of heroic structure, the next case will show how even indirect contact with the idea of Azathoth can fragment identity itself. The Haunter of the Dark, written 1935, is Lovecraft's final solo story, and perhaps his most refined experiment in layering cosmic implications beneath the surface of psychological obsession. Though Azathoth never appears directly, it hovers just beyond the veil, named only once, yet casting a shadow over every paragraph. The story follows Robert Blake, a writer who becomes fascinated with an abandoned church in Providence that once housed a heretical cult. As Blake's curiosity deepens, so does his exposure to something unthinkable. His fate is not sealed by what he discovers, but by what discovery implies. The plot centers on the shining trapezohedron, a crystal-like object used by the Starry Wisdom cult to summon a being called the Haunter of the Dark. This entity cannot survive light and manifests only in complete darkness. But it is not the final threat. As Blake reads deeper into the cult's history, he finds references to beings far beyond the Haunter. In his final notes, he writes in terror of the blind idiot god Azathoth, placing it not at the periphery, but at the unspoken apex of the cult's cosmology. The Haunter is terrifying, but it is only a servant. Azathoth is what it serves, unknowingly and without will. This single reference is easy to overlook, but it reorients the entire story. The entity Blake fears is horrifying because it connects, however distantly, to a force that does not know fear, cause fear, or respond to it. In this context, Azathoth is not a twist. It is the deep structure beneath Blake's unraveling. His descent is marked not by confrontation, but by realization. The more he uncovers, the more apparent it becomes that the universe is governed not by gods or demons, but by something fundamentally indifferent to both. The shining trapezohedron is not a window. It is a mirror, reflecting the absence of meaning behind the illusion of agency. We must pause here. Blake's madness does not come from what he sees. It comes from the recognition that seeing changes nothing. The Haunter has limitations. Light repels it, ritual binds it. But Azathoth has no boundaries. It is invoked, not summoned, named but never heard. Its single appearance in the text deepens the horror by destabilizing the entire cosmology. The cult Blake studies was not just misguided. It was reaching towards something that renders all spiritual structure obsolete. Blake dies not because he is hunted, but because his mind cannot contain the implications of what the cult once glimpsed. The narrative structure reinforces this effect. The story begins with a detached framing. Blake has already died. His diary is discovered posthumously. Readers are positioned not to witness the events directly, but to reconstruct them. This distance mirrors the distance between humanity and Azathoth itself. There is no contact, only the aftermath of exposure. Lovecraft uses this technique repeatedly when hinting at Azathoth. The danger is never immediate. It arrives secondhand, diffused through texts, voices, and objects that cannot be trusted. Thematically, the Haunter of the Dark extends Azathoth's influence into the realm of epistemology. The shining trapezohedron tempts Blake with visions, knowledge, and access, but what it offers is not understanding. it offers collapse. Blake's desire to know becomes indistinguishable from his desire to be undone. This is not traditional forbidden knowledge. There is no secret power, no leverage, no control, only a widening hole in the narrative structure where meaning used to reside. Azathoth is not the conclusion. It is the failure of conclusions. By placing Azathoth as a footnote in a story about obsession, Lovecraft performs a subtle inversion. Most horror fiction escalates toward a central monster. Here, the escalation leads to something too large to be described. The haunter is a conduit, not a climax. Gestures towards something that does not act, speak, or appear. And yet its name undoes everything. In this way, the haunter of the dark becomes one of the most successful deployments of Azathoth in Lovecraft's fiction. Not through presence, but through implication. In the next section, we will examine how later writers misunderstood or deliberately altered this structure, turning Azathoth from absence into character, and in doing so, diluting the very function that made it terrifying. The shift from unknowability to systematization would mark a turning point in the mythos, and one that reveals more about human instinct than cosmic order. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the world he had built began to change, not by accident, but by editorial intent. August Derleth, his friend, publisher, and self-appointed literary executor, undertook the task of preserving and expanding what he named the Cthulhu Mythos. But in doing so, Derleth imposed a structure Lovecraft had carefully avoided. Chief among the distortions was the redefinition of entities like Azathoth, not as metaphysical collapse, but as recognizable elemental beings in a moralized cosmology. Azathoth became, in Derleth's framing, a force of elemental fire, locked in conflict with agents of cosmic good. This transformation was not evolution, it was erasure. Derleth's system divided Lovecraft's beings into categories of good and evil, assigning elemental correspondences. Cthulhu to fire, Ithaqua to air, and Azathoth as a central evil akin to satanic chaos. He introduced the elder gods as protectors of human morality, a concept Lovecraft would have rejected outright. There is no evidence that Lovecraft believed in cosmic balance. His letters repeatedly describe a purposeless universe governed by indifference, not duality. In Derleth's reinterpretation, Azathoth loses its original function. It becomes a villain, something that can be opposed, even resisted. But resistance was never part of the equation. We must pause here. What Derleth did was not misreading. It was recategorization. He imported Christian metaphysics into a universe built on their absence. Azathoth, originally conceived as the center of non-order, a blind mechanism mistaken for a god, was reframed as an evil deity whose awakening would spell doom. This reduced its philosophical weight. It was no longer a structural threat to meaning. It was simply dangerous. The unknowable became antagonistic. The functionally inert became actively hostile, not because of textual necessity, but because myth needed to behave like myth again. Later writers often followed Derleth's lead. In role-playing systems like Call of Cthulhu, first published 1981, Azathoth appears as a stat-blocked entity. It is hit points, summoning rules, even weaknesses. It becomes a boss figure, an endgame enemy. These adaptations are commercially understandable but philosophically incoherent. They reframe Azathoth as a thing one might fight, or at least flee. But Lovecraft's original vision allowed for neither. Azathoth was never a character. It was a concept, one designed to short-circuit not just hope, but interpretation. Even writers who preserved Lovecraft's tone often struggled with Azathoth. Thomas Ligotti, one of the most philosophically aligned successors, rarely mentions it. Instead, Ligotti reabsorbs Azathoth's logic into narrative atmosphere. The universe as puppetry, the self as performance. In his fiction, Azathoth becomes unnecessary as a name because its function is everywhere. The horror lies not in the monster, but in the realization that the puppet show has no puppeteer. That's Azathoth, not hidden but unnecessary to name. Other authors attempted reintegration by returning to ambiguity. Ramsey Campbell, Caitlin R. Kiernan, and Laird Barron avoid Derleth's moral framework and restore indifference as the engine of dread. In some modern stories, Azathoth is mentioned only once or never at all, but its gravitational role remains. The story itself distorts. Narrative breaks down. Characters lose not their lives, but their ability to frame what's happening to them. This is not homage. It is reactivation. Azathoth's evolution reveals more about us than about it. Faced with an idea that erases control, readers and writers instinctively search for structure. Derleth's moralization, gaming's systematization, even well-meaning literary adaptations all bend the entity back toward familiarity. The unknowable becomes a villain. The indifferent becomes intentional. But that comfort is a betrayal. Lovecraft's Azathoth resists theology, categorization, and drama. It doesn't want, it doesn't act, it doesn't notice. That is why it matters. In the next section, we will explore how Azathoth, in its original and distorted forms, has escaped fiction altogether, becoming embedded in hoaxes, forums, and subcultures that treat it not as a character, but as a concept worth fearing. Its afterlife is not literary, it is cultural, and it continues to spread, not by proof, but by implication. Azathoth was never intended to be believed in, yet across forums, anonymous manifestos, Reddit threads, and low-resolution YouTube videos, it has begun to operate like something real. Not provably real, but almost. This is the threshold where modern myth forms, not through certainty, but through suggestion that refuses to collapse. In this cultural afterlife, Azathoth appears not as a deity, but as a pattern, a name without origin, a fear without center. It begins to resemble the very structure it once only represented, an idea so large and meaningless it cannot be dislodged once thought. Urban legends referencing Azathoth do not function like ghost stories. They rarely describe encounters. Instead, they suggest that encountering Azathoth is structurally impossible, that it happens in fragments, through dreams, signal loss, numbers that never end. A widely circulated 4chan post from 2017 describes a dream loop where the poster's sense of self was erased and replaced by the sound of flutes underneath static. No name is used until the end. Then a footnote. I think I heard something say Azathoth. I don't think it was outside the dream. The power here is not in the content. It's in the tone. Deadpan, fragmented, plausible. It spreads not because it is convincing, but because it feels adjacent to something no one wants to explain. We must pause here. This shift, from literary figure to whispered threat, mirrors older folk processes. The name of Azathoth now appears in liminal internet spaces, as a folder title in fake-leaked CIA archives, embedded in sound experiments uploaded without metadata, or mentioned once in deepfake videos with corrupted audio. The most effective hoaxes do not present themselves as hoaxes. They present as incomplete. An ARG-style podcast in 2021, The Threshold Archive, included a fictional transcript of a cult using EEG machines to synchronize brain noise, in order to get closer to the frequency of the blind center. The final line of the transcript simply reads, Azathoth, muffled. The creators never explain it. They didn't have to. Why does this idea persist? Because Azathoth offers something most urban legends don't. It explains the absence of explanation. It is not a monster in the woods. It is the logic of why no one comes back from the woods with a consistent story. It becomes a placeholder for all unresolvable anomalies. Missing time, dream recursion, the sensation of presence in empty rooms. One thread from a now-deleted subreddit titled Ard's Syntax Collapse told a story of a user whose family stopped recognizing them after a car accident, despite medical records confirming nothing happened. The final comment on the post, just the word Azathoth, capitalized, untagged. Azathoth's endurance in hoax culture reflects a universal cognitive tension. The human mind wants meaning, but suspects it doesn't exist. Most urban legends provide catharsis, a rule, a punishment, a ghost with a grievance. Azathoth offers no such closure. It gestures toward the possibility that disconnection is the rule. The stories don't warn, they erode. And this aligns perfectly with internet culture's appetite for recursive uncertainty. Creepypasta thrives on implication. Analog horror thrives on degraded context. Azathoth, already defined by its inability to be known, fits this medium like static fits a dead channel. Even the name behaves like a meme. It sounds ancient, but has no clear root. It implies force, but describes none. The syllables are just strange enough to be memorable, but too irregular to trace. This makes it ideal for invocation without commitment. Commenters drop Azathoth under glitched TikToks, audio distortion clips, or philosophical rants about reality being simulated. The name has become a digital rune, a gesture towards something everyone half remembers, but no one can cite. That is its power. Not fear, but atmosphere. This new folklore does not need to be true. It only needs to be retold, hinted at, passed around in pieces. The internet has become a perfect medium for Azathoth's afterlife because it allows information to spread while remaining unverified. In the next section, we'll examine how this atmospheric presence is reinforced by more structured adaptations in film, games, and music. But it's worth noting, the most faithful appearances of Azathoth are not in stories. They're in broken links, corrupted files, and phrases dropped where they don't belong. Azathoth is not showing up. It's already here, wherever narrative structure is failing. Azathoth resists adaptation, not because it is obscure, but because its core function, undermining structure, clashes with the conventions of most media. To visualize Azathoth risks reducing it. To dramatize it invites misunderstanding, and yet it continues to appear, often indirectly, across horror films, video games, and music, not as a character, but as a gravitational influence. The challenge is always the same. How do you represent an entity that cannot be represented? Many creators fail by trying. The most successful do something else. They echo the conditions Azathoth represents: disorientation, indifference, unreality, and let the name hover in the margins. In film, Azathoth is rarely depicted outright, and when it is, the result often contradicts its original purpose. In Stuart Gordon's From Beyond, 1986, a machine called the Resonator opens portals to unseen dimensions, resulting in sensory collapse and metaphysical fusion. Though Azathoth is never named, the underlying premise, a universe layered with incomprehensible motion, a center that mutates all who approach, mirrors its logic. Films like Event Horizon, 1997, and The Endless, 2017, follow a similar template. A location where time breaks, perception bends, and nothing responds. Azathoth does not appear. But the stories collapse under their own questions, which is closer to fidelity than spectacle. Video games have become the most effective space for Azathothian horror, not by portraying Azathoth, but by mimicking its psychological effects. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, places the player in an environment where knowledge is punishment, and seeing too much drives the character insane. The universe does not respond to progress. It breaks in response to understanding. Bloodborne, 2015, though ostensibly a gothic action game, leans heavily into Lovecraftian design. The deeper the player explores, the more reality itself begins to twist. Higher insight, a game mechanic, reveals horrors that were always there but could not be seen. The more you know, the more fragile your world becomes. This is not a mechanic. It is Azathoth in disguise. We must pause here. These games succeed because they reverse traditional player incentives. Knowledge does not reward. It dismantles. The protagonist does not become stronger. He becomes more aware that strength was never real. Azathoth appears in the architecture, not the credits. It is what makes plot progression feel like degradation. This is not X, but Y, not leveling up, but falling through false floors until nothing holds. The games never say the name. They don't have to. Azathoth isn't the boss fight. It's the reason boss fights feel meaningless once you realize how little they mattered. Music handles Azathoth differently. Because sound resists literalism, it becomes the most accurate medium for evoking the entity's atmosphere. Drone ambient artists such as Lustmord, Sun O, and Atrium Carcery create sonic landscapes that resemble Lovecraft's descriptions of thin, monotonous piping and infinite, mindless rhythms. These compositions often feature no melody, no climax, and no clear structure. They envelop the listener in repetition so extended it begins to feel like ritual, then machine, then void. One track from Cryo Chamber's Azathoth compilation features distorted throat chants layered over industrial drones for 20 minutes, with no variation. The piece does not build, it persists. That is Azathoth rendered faithfully, not in content, but in form. Some artists go further, embedding references without framing them. Black metal bands such as the Great Old Ones or Portal weave the name Azathoth into lyrics, liner notes, or track titles. But the words are often indecipherable. The texts blur into sound. Vocals distort into unreadable texture. This is not failure. It is thematic reinforcement. If Azathoth cannot be grasped, then the song must resist being held. The listener doesn't interpret. They endure. The best musical invocations make the audience complicit in their own dissolution of meaning. What unites these successful adaptations is their refusal to reduce. They do not try to explain Azathoth. They replicate its consequences. Films destabilize plot. Games punish knowledge. Music erases structure. Azathoth becomes an operational presence, less an image than a condition. When adaptations fail, it is because they reverse this logic. They turn Azathoth into a monster, a villain, a cosmic tyrant. But when creators let it remain vague, when they trust the audience to feel rather than decode, the effect is far more enduring. In the next section, we'll explore how Azathoth operates outside media, as a symbol adopted by subcultures, academics, and thinkers who see in it not fiction, but a metaphor for real conditions of modern life. Because the idea was never supposed to stay in stories. It was meant to leak, quietly, slowly, until it found somewhere to grow. Azathoth now exists in places Lovecraft never imagined. Academic journals, philosophical treatises, internet subcultures, underground art collectives. It has transcended its role as a fictional construct and become an emblem of structural dread. Not fear of death, not fear of monsters, but fear that meaning itself may be arbitrary, and that consciousness is a closed loop inside a universe that is not only indifferent, but incommensurable. In this form, Azathoth is no longer horror, it is framework. It allows different communities to express epistemic unease without needing to resolve it. In academic philosophy, Azathoth has appeared, sometimes jokingly, sometimes earnestly, in discussions of metaphysical nihilism, anti-natalist theory, and pessimistic materialism. The philosopher Ray Brassier, in his 2007 work Nihil Unbound, famously wrote, "Philosophy must reckon with the fact that reality is indifferent to our existence." Though he does not cite Lovecraft directly, the resonance is unmistakable. Azathoth becomes shorthand for the idea that the universe is not hostile, but structured in such a way that human categories like value, purpose, and truth are irrelevant. The terror, in this framing, is not that Azathoth might awaken, but that it already has, and we simply call it physics. Online subcultures have also embraced Azathoth, often ironically, but with lingering seriousness. In surreal meme spaces like OrchesX or a 4chan's paranormal board, or Discord servers dedicated to digital mysticism, the name appears as a kind of in-joke, used to label void core aesthetics, simulate cultic structures, or describe inexplicable experiences. My sleep paralysis demon whispered Azathoth and vanished. These are not literary fans. They are digital semioticians, remixing dread into something playable. Yet beneath the humor lies a consistent pattern. Azathoth is always used when explanation fails. It is not summoned. It is cited. We must pause here. Even the ironic uses participate in the myth. Azathoth's strength has always been its mutability. It thrives where logic breaks down. Subcultures use it to name moods that cannot be translated. The unease of staring at digital static. The sense that a meme knows more than it should. The moment when humor turns into exposure. Unlike religious symbols, which rely on doctrine, Azathoth works through implication. It becomes a free-floating signifier of the unspeakable. Underground art collectives and experimental theater groups have also invoked Azathoth, not as character, but as method. The 2020 Exhibition Center Cannot Hold in Berlin featured installations designed to collapse spatial logic, mirrored corridors that returned the viewer to the start, rooms with ambient loops so long they never repeated during the exhibit's runtime, textual fragments projected in unreadable fonts. The artists cited Lovecraft loosely, but the guiding principle was clear: to generate the sensation of thinking inside a system that erases thought. This is not Lovecraft fandom. It is structural mimicry. In these settings, Azathoth functions similarly to philosophical concepts, like the Lacanian real or Derrida's difference, terms used to describe gaps that cannot be filled, ruptures that structure meaning by remaining outside of it. Academics analyzing horror often place Azathoth alongside these notions, not to literalize it, but to map how it behaves. It is not a monster. It is a failure condition, a way to talk about the moment when systems collapse from too much internal consistency. That collapse doesn't scream, it drones. One might ask, why would modern subcultures or scholars cling to such a bleak emblem? The answer lies in utility. Azathoth does not comfort, but it clarifies. It names a boundary between what can be modeled and what resists modeling. It allows people to explore that boundary without demanding resolution. It fits a cultural moment increasingly defined by overload, data without interpretation, systems without agency, awareness without influence. In such a context, Azathoth ceases to be fictional. It becomes diagnostic. In the Iunaching, next and final section, we'll examine why Azathoth continues to haunt not just fiction or culture, but thought itself. Because long after the stories are read and the names are forgotten, the implications remain. Azathoth is not terrifying because of what it does, but because once its logic is seen, it cannot be unthought. Azathoth endures not because it fascinates, but because it cannot be fully dismissed. It represents an idea that stays lodged in the mind long after its fictional frame dissolves. Most horror fades with distance. Azathoth lingers, less like a story, more like a glitch in the architecture of thought. It persists precisely because it denies closure. Readers do not walk away enlightened or even afraid. They walk away marked by a structure of dread that feels too large to be contained by narrative. This is not fear of death. It is fear that everything we think of as real is, at its core, noise. At a psychological level, Azathoth operates as a model of epistemic vertigo, the experience of looking too far beyond the limits of meaning. The human mind evolved to detect pattern, intention, causality. Azathoth erases all three. It introduces the possibility that everything we experience is not only fragile, but accidental. Not in the sense of a malfunction, but as a condition. Reality is drift, not design. As Lovecraft hinted in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, to glimpse the thing at the center is to awaken into non-structure. The mind rejects this not out of weakness, but out of necessity. We must pause here. Most philosophical systems, however bleak, still assume there is something to interpret. Even nihilism often implies a kind of interpretive stance. Azathoth offers no such stance. It is not malevolent. It is not symbolic. It has no message. It is not a rejection of meaning. It is what remains when meaning is no longer part of the equation. This reveals something profound. Fear does not always stem from what threatens the body. It often emerges from what threatens the frameworks that keep us coherent. Azathoth is not a monster outside us. It is the collapse of the inside. This is why the figure has been adopted by pessimistic philosophers, surrealist artists, and experimental game designers. It provides a symbolic language for confronting the possibility that consciousness is not a crown, but a trap. That awareness does not grant access to truth, but only to the boundary of what truth might mean. Azathoth, in this light, becomes a mirror of the real-world anxiety that knowledge may outpace meaning. That science, philosophy, and self-reflection may peel away illusion until nothing recognizable remains. The terror is not extinction. It is endurance without understanding. Culturally, this reflects a broader shift. The 21st century is not defined by a lack of information, but by its excess. Individuals are saturated with data, global crises, contradictory ideologies, endless simulation. Azathoth has become the unconscious icon of this condition. It speaks to the moment when data stops enlightening and starts overwhelming, when coherence breaks down under the weight of its own processing. This is not X, but Y. Not mystery inviting exploration, but noise collapsing the map. Azathoth does not explain. It consumes the need for explanation. And yet, the figure remains strangely compelling. Readers return to it. Artists invoke it. Scholars analyze it. Why? Perhaps because Azathoth offers a rare form of honesty. It does not promise salvation, revolution, or even annihilation. It promises only that systems can, and perhaps already have, stopped making sense. For some, this is unbearable. For others, it is a relief. In a world filled with false certainty, Azathoth models what it looks like when certainty itself breaks. And in doing so, it becomes not just a symbol of horror, but of philosophical neutrality taken to its extreme. The question remains, why does it feel so real? Why does a fictional name from 1922 still haunt digital spaces, academic journals, and collective dreams? The answer may be simpler than it seems. Azathoth was never about the story. It was about the implications. Once introduced, those implications do not need to be invoked again. They echo, quietly, persistently. The figure at the center doesn't need to move. It only needs to be suspected. Because once the possibility of Azathoth is entertained, the world is never quite whole again. And perhaps it never was.